Most of the terrible laws that govern people emanate from parliaments.
What is it like to be a practicing advocate in South Africa?
My view on magistrates' courts is that that's where justice goes to die. The way to lead a good life in South Africa is not to say the government must, is to say we must. To say as citizens, we have a responsibility to look after ourselves, to create community structures that have mutual respect for other community structures, that foster individual rights, and push back against government excess.
Okay, so welcome to Real Talk with Dan Shaw. We are here with Mark Oppenheimer. Mark is an advocate and he has worked a lot in the Constitutional Court. And correct me as I go, but you are the president of the South African Institute for Race
Relations.
Okay, so you are constantly trying to find the level between what's hate speech versus what is freedom of speech. You also have a really interesting podcast where you discuss a lot of philosophical ideas and thought experiments, as you call them. Things like, is God real? Abortion, is it good or bad? A lot of these kinds of thought experiments on big topics that are very controversial. But I like the way that you address them in a way that's very neutral. It leaves room for a lot of conversation and expansive thought rather than opinions and emotions. Welcome on my podcast. Thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited to interview you because every time we speak, it's like hours and hours and hours go by because I love the way that your mind works. Okay, I'll stop talking. Just if you want to give us a brief introduction past what I've given in terms of you being an advocate and your history behind that.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, a lot of my life is really spent in conversation. And I think that one way to become a more complete, interesting person is to interact with a variety of people. So Brain Navat, the philosophy show, lets me summon up some brilliant mind once a week. I do it with my good friend, Jason Werbeloff, who's a sci-fi writer and philosopher. And having that conversation in that manner allows us to have these controversial conversations in a way that's like incredibly polite. So our method is to, first of all, start with these thought experiments where you've got some narrative device that plants a seed in someone's mind or a stone in their shoe where they go, oh, that's interesting. I feel a little bit uncomfortable about that. I want to know more. And so that's our sort of structural device. And then from there, we give the guest an opportunity to tell us about a particular philosophical idea. We make quite an effort to sort of distance the idea from the person. So we can all three of us in that conversation joust with the idea as opposed to joust with each other in a direct way that sort of feels like an emotional argument as opposed to an intellectual argument. And so the first thing we do is like, let's find out what this person's view is or the view we're discussing is. And then let's come up with the best counter arguments to it and see how it withstands that. And we think that's a really good way to find out what's actually true. So in that clashing of swords, you then sort of see these different ideals come up against each other. You check them against your intuitions. You check them against the other theoretical frameworks that you have, and then hopefully you make some progress. There's a similar thing that goes on in courts. So, my professional life is spent arguing cases, and it's a variety of cases. So a lot of the work that I'm very passionate about is this work on free speech and hate speech. And I've been involved in a whole range of fascinating cases on that. And the way that judges try and work out what's actually true is through this clashing of swords. We have an adversarial system in South African law. So you have often two or more parties making arguments in favor of their clients' cases. And in that debate, the judge tries to find out what's actually true and then produces a judgment. And then we have iteration over time. So judges sometimes get it wrong. And so they're overturned on appeal. We have this precedent-based system where we're slowly building up a body of knowledge over time. And some of those principles that we use in South African law have been around since the Roman era. There's eras that go like 2,500 years, and that's kind of amazing to be able to build up that body of knowledge. Similar thing that you find in philosophy. Some of the notions that we entertain now can be traced back to the ancient Greeks, or to the Enlightenment era. And then we make these modifications and we hope that we improve in the right direction. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes the academy moves drastically backwards and we lose a lot of common sense ideas, and that's kind of frightening.
What is it like to be a practicing advocate in South Africa?
Yeah, it's an unusual path. So if you think about lawyer as the big umbrella term, then advocates are a type of lawyer. and then you have attorneys. So my
What
work...
is the difference between the three, if you don't mind explaining?
Yeah, sure. So as I say, think about lawyers as an umbrella. So you've got advocates, attorneys, judges, legal academics that fall under that umbrella. So we're all, when someone says I'm going to call my lawyer, what they mean most of the time is I'm going to call my attorney. Members of the public will chat to an attorney. Often they practice in firms. So if you think about Bowman's or Edward Nathan Sonnenberg, big 5 firms, those firms will do a range of work. So sometimes it's going to be building something, like helping companies reach a merger, or drafting an anti-nuptial contract, or drafting a business relationship. Sometimes what happens is that things go south and you have to go to court and you have to have a fight. And at that point, the attorneys will brief an advocate on behalf of the client. So my relationship is with both the attorney and the lay client, but I can't deal directly with lay people. So what's interesting about our system is that while attorneys can choose their clients, advocates can't. So we have a thing called the cab rank rule, which means that if anybody asks us to do work in an area of law that we do, and they're willing to pay our ordinary rates, and we have time available, we have to say yes. And a lot of people are kind of surprised by this. They often want to associate the lawyer with the client and say, oh, you are this person. And we want to say, no, what we do is we help give those people a chance at justice. But often we might privately disagree with our clients' views. We are obliged to champion their interests, but we also have an obligation to the court to never mislead a court. So we're all officers of the court. I'll give you the kind of interesting kind of cases that arise in the criminal setting, which people often kind of can think of. I don't really do criminal law, but you can imagine someone who says, I have been accused of murder and I shot my wife in the head. Okay. And you can never then lead any evidence in the trial like your client was away in Hawaii, an alibi defense. It's false. And so if that evidence ever came out, you would have to withdraw from the case on the grounds that you can't participate in misleading the court. But it doesn't mean because someone has told you that they shot their wife in the head that there is nothing that could be done for their case. You might want to say, well, why did you shoot your wife in the head? You could say, well, I took a very high dose of a hallucinogenic drug and I thought my wife was a pumpkin. And you go, oh, okay, all right. So, we're not in the realm of like intentional murder anymore. Or you could say, well, at the time that I shot her, she was, launching at me with like a giant machete and it was self-defense. Oh, okay, all right, we've got a different defense here. So, and the other reason why we sort of think it's important to have this cab rank rule, we don't say no to people, is that sometimes someone gets accused of something really terrible and no one will want to defend them. So the famous case is about Baby Tsapang. So happened about 25 years ago. There's a play written about it called Tsapang, and there was a baby in Uitenhage that was raped. It's like the most like horrendous crime. And 6 guys were arrested for it, and their faces were plastered all over the newspaper. And the way the press dealt with it was, look at these like dastardly people who've done the most terrible things. These baby rapists should all be put to death. You had like this sort of like anyone who would dare defend them is doing something really reprehensible. And so a lot of people refused to act. And one attorney said, I'll do it. The first thing he did was say, let's get a DNA test done. Turns out it wasn't these 6 guys. It was the mother's boyfriend. So these 6 innocent guys are accused of the most reprehensible crime, and without good legal assistance, could have spent the rest of their lives in jail. Mm-hmm. And so that's why it's important to give people this fair shake. That cab rank principle is sort of constantly under threat. I think what's happened over time is that certain kinds of political work is viewed as bad for your career to do. So some of the cases that I'm involved in, are televised or featured in the newspaper. They're controversial. And there's a sense in which some of my colleagues disapprove quite strongly of the clients that I have and will, clutch their pearls at the fact that I act for, some of these clients. And I'll point out to them, we both signed up to the cab rank rule. And a lot of them will say to me, well, I would never take on a case like that and the cab rank rule will be damned. And I think that's a very dangerous thing. And so I think practice at the bar has changed quite significantly over time. I think a lot of our sacred values have fallen by the wayside. I think the other thing that's become kind of toxic about the profession is that what you're meant to be is a society of people who practice independently. So you're meant to be an independent kind of thinker. We don't work together in a kind of partnership. But we share premises with each other. So the idea is that you can knock on someone's door for advice. You can exchange ideas. And I think that's like a really important thing for helping train up new young lawyers. And one of the things that we've done that I think is kind of a real dereliction of our duties, when as advocates we sort of swear this oath to uphold the Constitution. Our Constitution is founded on the values of non-racialism and non-sexism. And so that means that we should treat people like human beings. We don't treat people as tokens for a type. So we don't think that all black people are interchangeable for each other, or all white people are interchangeable for each other. And we think that you should judge someone based on the content of their character, or the color of their skin. That's what the Constitution demands. And what the bar has done over the last decade or so is to entrench very strong racial quotas. And racial quotas have been viewed as illegal by the court. The racial quotas are for admissions. So one of the policies that was taken is to say when the Johannesburg bar admits its pupils, and you'll have about 100 that are taken in, they have a demographic representativity requirement. So Indian people, for example, make up about 2% of the population in South Africa. So the rule was we are capping the number of Indian people that will take to pupillage at 2. Now, that kind of racial engineering just harkens back to the days of apartheid, where you told people you're not allowed to practice in this profession because of the color of your skin. And there's these sort of stories that we grew up with as, as lawyers about, these famous lawyers who had to practice in corridors because of racist apartheid policies, because they were Indian. And we now do it again. And I feel like that's a kind of terrible thing to do to the industry, and for the sake of kind of trying to build up a non-racial society.
You are part of this institution. You're the president of this institution. Who set this up, first of all? I wanted to ask that. Was it set up with you?
So the Institute of Race Relations is South Africa's oldest classical liberal think tank. Started in 1929. So as much as I look like Jan van Riebeeck and I arrived here in 1652, I wasn't born when the Institute was set up. The Institute's had a very interesting history. It played a big role in exposing some of the sinister things that the apartheid government did. And one of the things that it would do is it had a thing called the South African Survey, which was to try and find out what's actually going on in the country. Let's gather data so that we have some information to push back against what the National Party government is saying. You had high levels of censorship in South Africa during apartheid. You had state-controlled media. And so having an institute that could then rebut that narrative was seen as very important. The institute has had a number of presidents over time. I think I'm the 13th or 14th president, and who've come from all sorts of interesting, illustrious backgrounds. Jonathan Jansen, one of South Africa's sort of famous academics, was a past president. Russell Lamberti, who heads up an organization called Sake Liga, which is a sort of business advocacy group, was my predecessor. But there have been religious leaders and academics and lawyers. The body is run by a CEO. The current CEO is John Endres. It was Frans Cronje for a long time. And what the Institute has done, I think, post-apartheid, is to say we've been critical of government for a long time, and we should continue to do that. We need to continue to hold government to account. And part of that is by doing intensive research. So Anthea Jeffrey heads up policy at the Institute and heads up research, and has written a number of books about the current status in Africa and talking about the transition period. It also acts as a lobby group. So some of the policies that have been adopted by the government have been anti-poor, been bad for the economy, and contravene the values of non-racialism. So they have opposed BE laws. They have opposed expropriation without compensation. They are in favor of redress, but it should be done on a non-racial basis. So if you as an individual were persecuted by the state during apartheid, that is good reason to receive compensation. They were very good, for example, at pointing out how much has actually been done on the land reform question. So there's a narrative that nothing has been done, and that's not really true. The land claims court process started in 1995 and concluded in 2014, and about 1.8 million people received compensation for land that was confiscated by the state during apartheid during that process. And about 95% of claims that were brought have been resolved. What's interesting as well is that when people are given the choice between land and money, more than 90% of people chose money. And that sort of shows that people want something fungible. They want to be able to lead a life of their choosing. They want to be able to maybe purchase a piece of land in an area that they want, start a business, pay off their loans, that there isn't this strong lust for land in South Africa. They also have something called the Hope Report, where they ask people, what are the most burning issues in the country? Race-based redress or racism and land reform both come out at around 1 or 2% of people's top priorities. The top priorities are seen as unemployment, about 34%, crime and education. And what's interesting as well is that when they ask South Africans of all different racial groups, there's quite a large consensus. White people, black people, colored people, Indian people tend to agree that the government has made poor decisions that have led us down a bad track, And they agree that the way to fix that is by having a society that is stable, so where you can trust your police force, where you've got a growing economy where it's easier to get jobs, and where you trust that your children will have a good education. So that's been the primary work of the Institute, I'd say, for the last couple of decades.
How do you define racism? Because I've heard a lot of people's stances on this, especially like just general public. And I've been in encounters myself where I had a girl tell me Black people cannot be racist because they're not oppressors. And white people can't experience racism because they're not oppressed. But I didn't really understand what she meant by that, because racism isn't that judging someone based on the color of their skin or their creed or their history or background or orientation, or how do you define racism?
So the classical definition of racism was to arbitrarily discriminate against someone on the grounds of their race, or to view particular racial groups as superior or inferior to other racial groups. And what we found is that there's been a move to try and replace those definitions, which I think most people would accept as good definitions and the kinds of things that are worth pushing against, with this idea of structural racism. And so what structural racism does is you say, well, it's not so much about individual actions, it's about a structure which has a race-based effect. Now, I think you can have concerns about structural racism. So I think, for example, if you design your society with a set of laws that discriminate against people on the grounds of race, or high incentives to discriminate against people on the grounds of race, that's structurally racist. We had that during apartheid. Now, I also think we've moved towards structural racism in South Africa because we have 142 race-based laws in South Africa, many of which require race capping, like I mentioned, like at the Johannesburg Bar, or race-based ownership. Those sorts of things are structurally racist. It's just that we are now targeting a different racial group. Now, this idea that we can divide people into oppressor and oppressed is sort of, I think, a very dangerous narrative. It implies that regardless of your individual actions, based purely on what you look like, we can make an assumption about you being an oppressor class or you being a victim class. Now, the difficulty with doing something like that is that firstly, you condemn people based on their race, not for what they did, but for what people that look like them did. And then you might try and compensate people, not based on whether they have suffered a wrong, but because they look like people who suffered a wrong. So if we think about an example, let's say I steal your car. I think you've got a good claim for recompense against me to say, to restore the justice, I should return your car, or I should pay you the value of the car. Now, let's say I steal your car, you're unable to institute the claim against me, but your daughter finds out that I had the car. Now, you might say she's got a claim as well, okay? It's just sort of as the person who would have inherited the car. Now, if we go down many, many generations, let's say for 350 years, we then start to think, well, that gets very dilute. Not clear what you would have done with the car. It's not clear that it would have remained in the family line for 350 years. Other things might have intervened, that you could have gambled it away, you could have sold it, So we kind of think that there should be some kind of cap on recompense. But we're not even dealing in that territory here. We're not even dealing with a sort of direct descendant. What you're dealing with is you look like someone who 350 years ago stole something from someone who looks like one of my ancestors 350 years ago. And so that's not a good basis. The other thing that I think is sort of naive about the black-white narrative is it's quite clear that regardless of the color of your skin, you can be an oppressor. So we don't have to roll that back in history. Go back to Rwanda. You had black people oppressing other black people, not on the basis of their race, but on the basis of their tribal affiliation or perceived affiliation, and slaughtering them in the most dramatic ways. I mean, you have 1 million people that are killed with machetes in Rwanda. So if you said black people can't be oppressors, that's outrageous. Now, you also have white people being slaughtered by other white people in Europe. You have all sorts of interethnic conflicts. I think the terms white and black aren't particularly useful. I think you've got people that happen to have a similar melanin count, who worship different gods, come from different parts of the world, who speak different languages. To clump them all together seems bizarre. If you think about who counted as white in America over time, this was a shifting thing. So when the Irish first arrived in America, they were not viewed as white. They were Catholics, that they didn't share the Protestant values of the Pilgrims. They were seen as outsiders. When the Italians arrived, when the Jews arrived, eventually over time they were sort of assimilated into this kind of Caucasian label. but you're dealing with people who weren't exactly friends with each other for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what are some of the most interesting cases that you've worked on as acting president of this institute?
Yeah, so one of the things that the Institute does is to try and think about what the burning issues are of the day. I have represented the Institute in court, and I'll tell you about one of the interesting cases that I did there, but that would have been with my advocate hat on as opposed to my president hat. But as president, we ran quite an interesting seminar series amongst council members of the Institute. So the body has members, it has council members who are, in a way, the kind of supreme governance body of the Institute to ensure that it lives up to its values and to contribute. The Institute also has a newspaper called The Daily Friend, which is the most public-facing aspect of it. I think The Daily Friend has got about 100,000 subscribers, and so it's probably more read than many of the traditional South African newspapers. And so there it'll be exploring some of the ideas that we've discussed around non-racialism, around land reform. At the time that we had our conference, it was just after our elections in May and before the formation of the GNU. And so we did a lot of discussion about this new opportunity that we find ourselves in South Africa, which is you now suddenly have ANC hegemony falling for the first time in 30 years, moving from 57.5% of the electoral vote to 40%. And the question was, is it a good idea for there to be some kind of coalition government? And so we spoke to DA members of parliament about that and what the risks would be. One of the views that was expressed was that the DA should stay out of a government of national unity, that they should rather support a minority government, which the ANC is the sole member of, and that the leverage by the DA would be in passing laws and in passing budgets. What's interesting is that we now have a situation where the DA has refused to sign on to the ANC budget. And so we had, for the first time in 30 years, the budget speech delayed. So, yeah, that kind of scenario planning and thinking about what are the opportunities that liberal organizations like the DA could have? Is there a concern that they'll be tainted by being in bed with a traditionally sort of race nationalist socialist organization like the ANC? And then what the role of civil society organizations will be. So one thing that we forecast is that it's going to be more difficult for the DA to be in government and sue government at the same time, and that a lot of that work will have to be done by organizations like the Institute or by others like AfriForum Solidarity, the Free Market Foundation, Sakeliga. And so those conversations have often led to many more conversations about where we need to be as a country.
You said you were going to touch on one of the cases that you had worked on.
Yeah, so the first case that the Institute ran in court, the Institute has sort of taken the view that it's a think tank and that its primary focus should be in disseminating ideas, but had warmed to this idea that courtrooms are a good place of influence, that they are often theatrical places as well, they give you a stage to express your ideas. And so they'd kind of been looking around for litigation to get involved in for a while. And an opportunity was thrust on their laps with very short notice, which was in 2021, the Electoral Commission said, we can't have elections because of COVID. We don't think they could be free and fair. And they then approached the Constitutional Court basically for permission to not run the elections. And the Institute then joined those proceedings. And you had a number of parties taking different views about what should be done. Very novel situation. So you're going to the Constitutional Court, I think, on an extremely short period of notice. So I think we did it within 2 weeks. Normally it could take 10 years to get to the Constitutional Court in a matter. And you've got this deadline in our Constitution about when you have to have elections. The deadline basically says you have to have elections every 5 years. This would have been for our municipal elections. And you are entitled to delay them up to 90 days. That's all it says. And we had never delayed our elections before. But you have this concern that people are going to be worried about going to the polls. They don't want to, get COVID or, infect other people or whatever it is. But other countries had elections. So we had this interesting question before us. The Institute took an interesting line. We said, we think it's unconstitutional to delay the elections. We think you have no right to do it. But if you think you do have that right, then we want to give you an alternative way to run the elections. Given that we were dealing with municipal elections, there was no need to run the elections on one specific day like you would for a national election. And we said, given that the COVID graphs kind of roll depending on where you are in the country, that what you could do is run elections in places where you've got, let's say, low incidence rates, and then you could wait a short period of time and run high incidence, run in the rest of the country when you have, the wave sort of settles down. The Constitutional Court ultimately took the view, you cannot deviate. It's absolutely illegal not to run elections, and you have to do it. And so our elections occurred, and there was a sort of sea change in a lot of cities. And the ANC had sort of taken quite a strong beating in those elections and, sort of, I think, laid the way for our national elections last year.
Mm-hmm. So I would love for you to explain, because it's something that I don't completely understand, the difference between the Constitutional Court, the High Court, normal court.
Yeah, so we have a different tiers of courts. So you have magistrates' courts, which are different. Magistrates' courts are stocked by magistrates. A lot of disputes will be dealt with in magistrates' courts. So
what's the difference between a magistrate and a judge?
Part of it is the training. So a magistrate doesn't have to have a full law degree. They often might have come to it through a prosecuting route and will often not have necessarily have been in private practice. So the kinds of things that magistrates' courts can deal with, quite a variety of matters. Most criminal matters are going to be dealt with in magistrates' courts, but they can also deal with commercial disputes within a kind of RAND limitation. My view on magistrates' courts is that that's where justice goes to die, that you have an increasing number of delays. It's very hard to sort of ever get your matter heard. Some people like the idea of magistrates' courts because they're viewed as less expensive. I found that litigation that I've run there has been more expensive because of the delays and a sort of reluctance to bring things to finality. High courts, traditionally, most judges were advocates. So they would have been at the bar for decades. They would have probably achieved a status called senior counsel, which is that when your colleagues think that you've reached a point in your career where you are now deserving of this appellation, often through running big teams of advocates or having a lot of cases reported in the law reports, they would then nominate you for senior counsel status. In the UK, it's King's Counsel, or was previously Queen's Counsel, and then you get letters patent from the president. And so judges came from the ranks of senior counsel. A relative of mine was the first attorney to be appointed a judge, and probably opened the floodgates to hell by doing that. Partly because, an advocate's practice is largely in court. You understand court mechanics, you understand our procedural mechanisms, our mutual respect between people. Attorneys who do litigation often will have that access, but a lot of them will never go to court, and so will be a bit alienated by the court process. Of course, there are some judges who were attorneys who are excellent. There are some judges who are academics who are excellent. I ran a series about the Constitutional Court, podcast called Constitutional Landmarks, and one of the judges that I interviewed was Yvonne Machoro, and Yvonne was an academic and wrote one of our first big free speech judgments. Yvonne tragically passed away quite recently, but really was a legal giant. And so I don't think you have to be an advocate to become a judge, but there is some advantage in it. So the high courts are then placed in all the different provinces. Some provinces have more than one high court. So Gauteng has Pretoria and Johannesburg. I think the Eastern Cape have 3 courts. There's like Bishu, Grahamstown, and PE. Then you have the Supreme Court of Appeal, which can hear cases on appeal from any of those high courts. And then you have the Constitutional Court that can hear appeals either from the Supreme Court or in a situation where a high court makes a constitutional decision. So they strike down a statute on the basis that it's unconstitutional. That has to be certified by the Constitutional Court. And so it will go directly to the Constitutional Court from there.
So Constitutional Court, I always put in the same bracket as making the law and keeping the law safe. Again, I'm layman. I don't do this stuff, but it's nice to understand. So the Constitution is where all of our laws are founded from, no?
Okay, so we have a mixed legal system in South Africa. So before the Constitution, so we had an interim Constitution, and then we have the final Constitution, which is in 96.
You had what institution?
The interim Constitution. The interim Constitution was basically, we've got this transition away from apartheid. We haven't yet had elections. So our elections were in 94. The interim Constitution was agreed to in 93 through a kind of constitutional assembly process and through mutual negotiation. And then you had a final constitution that deviates in some respects from the interim constitution that comes out in 96. The Constitutional Court's first judgment came out in 95, and so it was based off the interim constitution. First judgment that's published is on the death penalty. And so one of the episodes of Constitutional Landmarks, we interviewed the judges and advocates who are involved in abolishing the death penalty. So the Constitution is sort of seen as our supreme law, but it's not really the source of all law because we had many things that predate it. So the one is common law, and that is in some sense judge-made law. So traditionally, the way that common law accrues is that you have two people who go and see a wise man, and they say, we've got this conflict. And he says, okay, well, let's resolve it like this. And he creates a principle. And then that principle gets used the next time people come with a similar conflict. And then what happens is that, you do that hundreds of thousands of times, and you now build up a body of law. And sometimes those principles develop because the facts are slightly different. So we go, oh, that's not quite what it would look like in the prior case. So I guess we should make this adjustment or this exception.
But see, there's where my confusion or question comes in. Who's the wise man? And who gets to choose whether things get tweaked or changed? Isn't that always done in the Constitutional Court? Or can the Supreme Court rule that a law is no longer necessary and we're going to change it?
So the common law basically develops through judges. And so common law systems you find in America and the UK and here. And so you kind of have this body of cases that set up these principles. And so what you have are judges who then tweak that in subtle ways. That's the one body of law. Then you have legislation, which is passed by Parliament. And we used to have parliamentary sovereignty. So in other words, whatever Parliament decided the law was, that's the law. And then it would trump the common law. So if there was ever a clash between legislation and the common law, legislation would win. With the advent of the Constitution, what you have is an obligation to develop the common law in line with the Constitution. So in line with the Bill of Rights, for example, and that if legislation falls short of the Constitution, then it can be struck down for being unconstitutional. There are some things in the Constitution that require particular pieces of legislation to be passed. So, for example, access to information and administrative justice, those sorts of things, legislation was created and the Constitution sort of mandated. The Equality Act is sort of seen as the bit of legislation that deals with discrimination law from the Constitution and with hate speech.
Okay. That makes a little bit more sense.
Yeah. So we have, in other words, if you think about the Constitutional Court is partly the guardian of the law in ensuring that the particular cases that come before it, that when you're challenging a piece of legislation for being unconstitutional, that they are then obligated to strike it down if it is unconstitutional. Sometimes that means referring it back to Parliament to rewrite it. So a good example would be our Marriage Act. So in 2005, there was litigation challenging the failure of the state to provide for gay marriage. And the argument was that you cannot discriminate against people on the grounds of sexual orientation in terms of Section 9 of our Constitution, that if you were gay, you could not get married. Therefore, the Marriage Act, which said marriage between a man and a woman, was unconstitutional. And you had two different views that came from the Constitutional Court. The one was Cato Regan's view, which is that it's clearly on its face unconstitutional, and the court must now proclaim the right to gay marriage. And then Albie Sachs's view. And Albie said, well, this is a very important question, and you definitely should have gay marriage, but this should go through Parliament. That the court's job is not to make law. The court's job is to interpret the law. And that's generally seen as the role of judges, is that they're not lawmakers, they're law declarers. And that Parliament must engage in a process where it allows for public participation so that people can express their views about gay marriage, and their ultimately legislation must come about. And it meant a 2-year delay. And I remember people feeling a sense of frustration of, we know what the right answer is, why don't we just get there now? But I think what we've had in South Africa is, because there was this public deliberative process that everybody got a chance to sort of express their views, that when the law came about, it wasn't forced upon them up on high by 11 judges who were unelected. And I think gay marriage is largely accepted in South Africa. Now, ways in which that can go badly, if you look at America, for example, their Supreme Court, which is very similar to our Constitutional Court, declared a constitutional right to abortion in the case of Roe versus Wade. And they did it in a manner that some would say was about making law. So how they got there was they said, you have a right of due process. There's another case that says that due process rights include privacy rights. The Americans don't have a right to privacy in their constitution like we do. They also don't have a right to explicit healthcare, and we have things like healthcare rights that include things like bodily autonomy and things like that. So in South Africa, it'd be quite easy to argue that there's a constitutional right to abortion. In the States, not so clear. But the court says, because you have this right to privacy, we think that that includes a right to abortion, and we're going to tell you how that abortion right must work, which is they set up a trimester system. And so you're entitled to get an abortion up to 24 weeks, I think was their original row. 24 weeks is pretty far down the line and out of kilter with the rest of the Western world. So in South Africa, for example, 12 weeks is no questions. And that 12 weeks is sort of what you find in Europe as well. Maybe 13, maybe 14. In South Africa, if there's like an economic or social reason, you can go up to 20 weeks. And then life of the mother, obviously you can have exceptions up until the point of birth. Now, for 49 years, you then had a situation where people could do nothing to change that abortion law. There was no legislation that could be passed because the Supreme Court has decided that this is constitutional right. And so you then politicize the court. And the only way that the pro-life lobby could get what they wanted done was to ensure a change in the composition of the court. And eventually that happens. A couple of years ago, the court declares Roe versus Wade wrong, sets it aside and says there is no constitutional right to abortion, which means the court can say nothing about it. They don't ban abortion, but they basically say it's up to the states to decide. So the federal government could go and pass some law as well. They could create a constitutional right to abortion. They could create a ban on abortion, but you have to have the political numbers. And so I think our constitutional court has understood this balance about where you're supposed to be, that if you push too hard against the executive or against the legislature, that they'll push back. Because the way the separation of powers works is that the court can invalidate laws, but you have a body that gets to appoint judges. So, you'll wind up with a situation where more and more pro-executive judges will get appointed because, the other set will be viewed as activist judges who are, failing to live up to their constitutional obligations.
How do you become a constitutional judge? Are they advocates or are they judges?
Yeah, so we have a body which appoints judges. The Constitution basically sets up a thing called the JSC, the Judicial Service Commission, where judges are interviewed for all ranks. So for High Court appointments, Supreme Court, and the Constitutional Court, there's a public interview process. In the first Constitutional Court, you had people from quite a variety of different sectors. So I mentioned Yvonne Mokgoro, who was an academic. Albie Sachs had been a political activist, an advocate, and an academic, also in the first court. Someone like Johan Krichler was a Supreme Court judge, Supreme Court appeal judge, and a High Court judge. There's also an opportunity to allow people to act as judges, which means you take on a temporary appointment as a judge. And a couple of people recently did that, like someone like David Bilchert, who was an academic. But in practice, what's happened recently is that most of the judges of the Constitutional Court were judges at some lower court first. They serve terms which are capped by time. I think it's 12 years. In America, it's a life appointment. So that's also why there was such fierce contestation to ensure that, the president picks judges that suits, let's say, that political party's agenda, because that person could be there for life. And if you pick them when they're young, they could be there for 30, 40 years. So a lot of judges would then also die on the bench. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, Anton Scalia died, and it can create these sort of crisis moments where there's now pressure to try and appoint. So we've had quite a lot of change, and unfortunately we've lost some very strong judges who probably could have had longer careers. Someone like Katie Regan was appointed in her 30s and now has a sort of afterlife as an academic.
When you say that Parliament makes laws, is that from the High Court? Or does Parliament have their own judicial system and lawyers and advocates? Or I struggle to make the separation in my mind as to like where all of this stuff is happening.
Sure. So my simple answer would have been parliamentarians sit in Parliament, but we burnt our Parliament down. So they now sit in a tent.
You're joking.
No, I'm serious. So it's kind of a crazy thing that we don't really talk about it, but yeah. So I did a submission to Parliament around whether our constitution should be changed to allow for expropriation without compensation, and argued that it shouldn't be changed. And the place in which I gave that argument no longer exists because it was burnt down.
The one in Pretoria?
No, Parliament's based in Cape Town.
Oh, I didn't know that. You see, Very naive.
So one way of thinking about South Africa is that we had these different capital cities. So Pretoria being the Union Buildings, where the president is based. Parliament being in Cape Town, so the legislative capital. And then Bloemfontein was seen as the judicial capital because our highest court was the Supreme Court of Appeal before the Constitutional Court was created. Now, they're very different kinds of places. When you vote in a national election, you vote for a political party, and that political party will have a list of people that it will then choose to become members of Parliament. And those members of Parliament form the legislature, and they will then vote on laws. So, for example, the Expropriation Act.
But are these people advocates? They're not just random people off the side of the road that somebody's cousins or uncles or brothers. These are people who actually know the law, correct?
Absolutely not. Like,
Wow.
no, like members of parliament, as I said, it's a political body. So I think there are very few requirements to become a member of parliament. And one might be
How
being a
is
South
that
African
the
citizen
case?
and being like over 18.
How? These are people making laws about our livelihoods. How is that possible?
So parliament... So there's a view which is that basically most of the terrible laws that govern people emanate from parliaments, that the good laws emanate from the common law and from judges. So there's a kind of libertarian view that government should be small, and that if you look at a lot of the laws passed by the legislature, they're pernicious, they're anti-freedom. So the common law didn't really have... Race is anathema to the common law. You don't have laws that create rules about races. They talk about human beings, whereas legislatures will create race-based rules, like the apartheid government, like the Nazis, like the Soviets, and so often quite dangerous. It's very rare in South Africa that we've looked at a piece of common law and thought, this is a really vile law and should be overturned. Most of the time that something is overturned, it's a law made by parliament. And you might think it's because it comes from politicians who don't necessarily have to have any expertise. It's common in America for congressmen and senators to have had a legal background. And there have been times where politicians in South Africa have had a legal background. I think that's probably become quite rare now. And so often someone has a political base, they're popular, they're a good speaker, or they've managed to climb the greasy pole within their party. We don't have a constituency-based system. So it's not like the people who you live amongst choose you to be their leader, like a ward councillor. Basically your party chooses you and puts you on a list based on either what you know about other people in the party and what skeletons in the closets you know about, or because you've enmeshed yourself in some kind of devious way.
But how did our common law not take that into account in terms of who was allowed to be elected into parliament to make law?
Yeah, it is quite common, I think, for political systems to not have a firm rule against people being members of parliaments.
But there should be a percentage of people that are in the party that know what the hell's going on in the law.
Yeah. So what you might have is that while parliamentarians are the official body that creates laws, that they will set up specialist committees, for example, that will focus on a particular issue, that they will then consult with civil society organizations. So there's this public participation process. And often I think what they'll do behind the scenes is say, here's our vision as politicians, what we want the law to look like. And that vision will then be sent to a set of lawyers who will then draft something that coheres with that vision. And you will have internal state advisors who are lawyers who will say, this is what we think the law should look like, and this is why we think it's constitutionally permissible. Now, often they get it wrong. And so if I think about the laws that I've lobbied on in Parliament, like the hate speech law, I'd been involved in a lot of the cases to strike down sections of our old hate speech law, being the Equality Act, and we were successful on that. And that case law then shaped the Hate Speech Act, which creates a crime. And so the original versions of that act were like really, really anti-freedom, very dangerous. You could have been jailed for making jokes about politicians. That's the kind of thing that can be fought back against. But you had state legal advisors saying this is perfectly fine. And at some point, some of them were like, well, we know we can't really say that anymore because constitutional courts weighed in on this and things like that. One thing that we can be thankful for in South Africa is that we have an incredibly inefficient government. People often say, the problem with South Africa is we've got these great policies and the government is very bad at implementing them. The reverse. We have absolutely terrible policies, but thankfully we have a government that is really inept and very bad at carrying them forward.
Like what? What's a good example of that?
Good example of it is expropriation or compensation is like an absolutely terrible policy. It destabilizes property rights. You make all South Africans subject to the state in a sense that they no longer feel like the land that they live on belongs to them. It can be taken away at a whim. That's very dangerous. That's the kind of thing we had during apartheid. So land reform is, I say, a fair process. And you can, for example, if you say, look, we want to try and build up a farm for these people, we're going to give them adequate training and resources. So we'd like to buy your farm and create a project where you sort of help train these guys up, and we're going to pay you for your farm. That's fine. No problem, right? And some of that has happened in South Africa. Unfortunately, a lot of those farms have failed. About 90% of the farms that were bought for land reform purposes no longer operate as farms. But in principle, you could think that's a sort of fair policy. But when we say we're going to take it and give you nothing, well, then you remove all incentives for people to look after their land, people to sort of period of tenure. So that's very dangerous. I think a lot of our race-based policies have been very bad, very anti-labor. So we have one of the highest employment rates in the world, unemployment rates. And as I say, as a prosperous society requires people to work in it, to pay tax. And so if you make it very hard to hire people because it's very hard to fire them, well, or if you have a whole bunch of other kinds of stringent labor laws, that's a bad policy. And so one way to think about it is that the government, I suppose, in some areas will make businesses' lives very difficult and, really turn the screws and, have these harsh enforcements. And other areas, I think it just lacks the capacity. And so people will kind of ignore the law, and I think probably ought to ignore the law in a lot of things. I think civil disobedience in the face of an unjust law is a perfectly justifiable approach. If what you care about is being a pro-growth nation, and all political parties say we want growth, they just have different ideas of how to get there. So the EFF will say we want more growth, and they say the way to get there is to nationalize everything. It's like it hasn't worked out very well historically.
Idea.
Yeah. But if you want to unleash growth, then what you want to do is, unleash the power of markets. That the best job creator is business, it's not government. So you want to make it easy for businesses to prosper. You probably want to lower a bunch of taxes. You want to make it much easier for people to hire people, make it less of a risk that if you hire them and it doesn't work out, that you now can't fire the person. You're also dealing with all these other competitors to employment, right? Like mechanization, AI, so make it easier for people to hire. That will mean that more revenue is generated. That means you've got a higher tax base. Also, we've got a lot of looting that goes on. I mean, the state capture project, really robbed the South African treasury coffers, and so we've had almost no accountability on that front. I think there are many government officials who basically see South Africa as a cow that it's in its dying days, and that instead of trying to nurse it back to health, the view is just try and get as much milk and meat out of it as you can. And so the looting project has just continued, in a more and more rapacious manner. I think that you could probably cut down a number of government departments. I mean, if you look at what the Americans are doing with Doge, they're identifying all this wasteful expenditure, all these projects that, the American taxpayer is paying for. You go like, why are we spending $8 million on transgender mice? Those sorts of things are going to upset people. And so in South Africa, I'm sure we have enormous amounts of waste. If you look at
unreal.
Yeah. And part of that's through like an official system. When you have a race-based tender process, for example, one of the cases that I ran was on preferential procurement. So when the government builds a project, it doesn't itself have the capacity to build it. So it says, okay, we'll have a tender and we'll see who's able to do it. And what we had was initially a sense that for projects under 50,000 Rand, you could take into account previously disadvantaged individuals, non-racial was in character, and you could give them more points when they apply. But the primary purpose of the points would be to look at, are you able to do the job, and are you doing it at a good price? What happened over time was that 50,000 number got changed to 50 million. So basically all projects, then had this like high amount of additional points configuration stuff. And then instead of it being about disadvantage, it was about race. And then there was a move to say, actually, we're just going to disallow anyone who doesn't have a certain amount of race-based ownership from competing at all. So which then had a huge price distortion. So what you might have had was a business like, let's say, Fidelity Guarding Services, who were involved in this litigation. White owned, but 50,000 people that work for them are black. Okay, so they provide guards to all sorts of municipal buildings around the country. They come in with a good quote, and so that's seen as the baseline. Competitors then have to compete against that quote. And so Fidelity did quite well, even though they didn't have the race-based ownership, they would tend to get the bids. Then you say, don't let these guys compete at all because of the white ownership, and so their number falls out. So what then happens is someone says, well, my cousin just started a security business like 3 weeks ago and meets the race criteria. They charge double what Fidelity charged, but it's okay because it's no longer in the bid. So that number then falls away, which means you have looting of state coffers in favor of a very small cryptocratic elite, and to the detriment of the 50,000 black guys who used to work for Fidelity. So you have the cover of, we're doing this for good social justice reasons, we want to redress the wrongs of the past, but actually what you're doing is helping a connected few become very prosperous.
Yeah, and it's mostly cronies.
Yeah. Well, the deal is we say, look, we're going to ensure that our mates get these contracts, and you're going to ensure that we remain in power. So one of the understood provisos is you get tenders and you donate some of that money back to the ANC. And I think at some point, those guys were like, I'm not going to donate so much to the ANC anymore. And so the ANC, found itself bankrupt at one point. Its debts were then mysteriously paid for just before the elections, after having met with the Iranians and with Hamas. There's a view that that's where the debts were dealt with. But the ANC took like a huge beating in the elections anyway.
Okay, so in a nutshell, I think I've got the same kind of opinion as most people I know, that we don't really get involved in politics. We don't really bother ourselves with this stuff because it's ever changing. It's out of our control. It's very depressing. It feels like the whole country is just falling apart. I drove past my old house and like almost all the shop fronts are closed. What is actually going on with South Africa, the state of South Africa, our politics with America? What is your stance on it? Because obviously there's a lot of misinformation out there.
Yeah, I think being a South African is to live a life of whiplash, where we have moments of huge jubilation and hope, and then we have moments of despair. And it's quite hard to predict which cycle we're going to be in. I think we are a very resilient nation. We've gone through a lot and have developed some incredible skills to circumnavigate some of the difficult landscape. I was just interviewed by Jan Hirsi Ali, who's someone herself who's been incredibly brave and led a resilient life. She'd escaped persecution in Somalia, became a politician in the Netherlands, faced death threats, and is now an academic in America.
Wow.
And we spoke about where South Africa finds itself in, and I said to her that as much as our government has really been a sinister force in South Africa, it's made a lot of people's lives worse, and it's sort of been very good to a small crew of mates. The private sector has done incredibly well, and we have a very vibrant civil society. So you've got a lot of organizations like the ones I mentioned before, like the Institute, like the Free Market Foundation, like AfriForum, who have said the way to lead a good life in South Africa is not to say the government must, it's to say we must. It's to say as citizens, we have a responsibility to look after ourselves, to create community structures that have mutual respect for other community structures, that foster individual rights, and push back against government excess. And those structures have been very successful. So I was chatting to someone who's a EFF stalwart, would describe himself as a black nationalist communist. And I said to him, tell me about what your last experience was like in Home Affairs. This was before Leon Schreiber took over. He said, geez, yeah, it was pretty grim. I had to get there like crack of dawn. There's this like incredibly long queue. The whole room was just filled with nothing but like despair. And it took a very, very long time for my thing to get resolved. I was like, okay. I said, and the last time you went to MTN to go and like buy a cell phone and get your contract renewed? He was like, yeah, it was actually quite amazing. Like, there's like stores all over the show, and, it was like quite competitive pricing, and like the price of cell phones has like really come down. And it's amazing that I can have this like super fancy smartphone that would have cost like, 20 times the cost a few years ago. It's like, yeah, that's the difference between, state-led projects and the private sector. The fact that the poorest of the poor can have access to a smartphone with cheap internet, start a side business on that. Like, that's incredible. That's an amazing thing. Can you imagine if instead of that, we had the government-made cell phone? It would look like our landlines still. So once you accept that government has the reverse Midas touch, everything it touches turns to excrement. And you sort of look at how good the private sector is in South Africa, in some ways better than in other countries.
Yes.
So
like our banking system,
yeah,
our
our banking
medical
system
aid.
is one of the best in the world, medical aid. I mean, I've got American friends who, so they were South Africans who moved to America, who will come back home for medical treatment because the quality of the care is very good, private sector. It's quite affordable in comparison to the States, and you can get it very quickly. In Canada and the UK, where you're subject to a state-based system, you can wait months to go and see a GP. So yeah, it's paid for by the government, but it's not very good, and you might die of the illness that you have. So you get people who they say, hey, well, you've got cancer, but we can't send you to an oncologist until it moves to like the level 3 when it's really aggressive. Then maybe we can give you some chemo, but otherwise hold tight. We'll check in with you. Yeah, you can go see a doctor immediately. So we have it good in some ways. Ayan describes South Africa as a country within a country, and I think that's right. That you have enclaves that work pretty well, where you've got communities that have protected themselves with, private police, really, private schools, private water, private electricity, solar and boreholes. And you kind of escape your little enclave and you get onto a pothole-filled road, and drive at night when there's no street lamps, and you sort of get worried that someone's going to put a gun against your face. But the enclaves are pretty nice.
Yeah, the polarity is crazy. But the whole world feels like that kind of these days, especially like in the States. There's so many amenities that are good. Like I don't live there, so I don't get affected by the medical system. But there's amazing opportunities there that you wouldn't necessarily have here. But then the homeless crisis and the drug epidemic is just out of this world. Never seen anything like it before. I wanted to ask you about like the hypocrisy of, we all have to comply with this Poppy Act, which is to me just the most ridiculous thing. I understand it, but in terms of the procedure as a business, it's pathetic. It's like, I don't understand why there's so much paperwork to go through. Yet the government can just pass a law to say all CCTV cameras now have to be state-owned, basically, like the footage on it. How are they allowed to do that? And how does that comply with Poppy? That's like completely against the principles of it, isn't it?
Yeah, so I think Poppy's interesting piece of legislation, one of the reasons why people get so upset by it is that it's not well understood. So you'll suddenly have these compliance officers that will kind of create all these rules that aren't necessarily in the Act. I think a lot of it is burdensome and probably not particularly useful. I know in some of the litigation that I've been involved in where we've sought information that we're entitled to, we'll get a kind of, we can't give it to you because of Poppy sort of line, even though the Act actually makes it quite clear that if you've got other obligations to hand over, you must. The CCTV thing, as far as I understand, is a sort of municipal bylaw that's come out in Joburg. And I suppose we shall see how it winds up. As I say, laws passed by politicians tend to be pretty bad. And I haven't looked at the full details of that thing, but there is a sense in which, you having received permission to disseminate the information that you get on your CCTV cameras, or the idea that it's not yours, that sort of, all your base will belong to us, government line is pernicious and must be fought.
Yeah. My friend was saying if someone robs your house and you want to post that on social media to warn other people, you're not allowed to do that.
Yeah, that's, as far as I understand, one of the implications of that bylaw, which seems kind of crazy,
That's ludicrous.
Yeah. And you might think as well that one of the things that shame the South African government is that footage. So when you have people sort of saying, let me show you how dangerous South Africa really is, and you see people being hijacked at their gate, or you see these sort of guys attacking people on farms, that footage then is really good evidence. And so you might think one of the ulterior motives for trying to ban this dissemination is to cover up crimes.
Totally. But why would that be something that they want in terms of like the everyday man who's stealing your car out your house or whatever it may be? Why does the South African government want to protect him off social media? Is it to not give South Africa a bad reputation overseas?
That's a possibility. It's to protect its own name. The other one is that I got sent one of those videos recently where one of the guys in the video has got a military-grade jamming device, which implies that either he got it through some illicit mechanism, or that he's a member of the South African military, or obtained it from the South African military, which shows some level of state negligence or complicity. And so then banning the footage, you may think, gets you out of that problem.
But it's banning the truth.
Yeah, exactly. And that's sort of, we sort of spoke earlier about why free speech is so important. If you think about some of the crazy rules that happened during the COVID era, where people were silenced, and then later we discovered the thing they were silenced for was actually true. It's very dangerous. It's one of the reasons why you want to allow people to speak, is that finding out what's true is really important to solve the problems that you have. Even allowing people to say false things is important, because they can be corrected and they can change their minds, and they can be corrected through reasons. You can provide counter evidence to say, hold on a sec, you're mistaken for these reasons. There's a danger when you start to mislabel things as misinformation, disinformation. So you alluded to it earlier with the Trump executive orders. What Trump has done is point out that South Africa has adopted a path that is antithetical to the values of America and not good for continuing its relationship. Now, our relationship with America is really important to us. It's our second biggest trading partner. The things that are identified in that executive order are, one, the threats of expropriation without compensation. We've just passed a law that does this. The way that the executive order describes it is that it is ongoing. Now, I think that might be incorrect, but clearly there's the ongoing threat of it. And so that's pretty damn close to a serious problem.
So did the Constitutional Court say that that was fine to do? for
No.
them to pass that law. So
We-
then how come so they have to counteract it?
So, yeah, so what you first have is the law gets signed. Now, Ramaphosa could have, before signing it, said, given that this legislation is really contentious, I'm going to refer it to the Constitutional Court directly to get an opinion. He did this with the Copyright Act. It's a very rare thing to happen. But instead, what you now have is litigation over the act. So the DA have brought a case to say the whole act is unconstitutional for procedural reasons, that there weren't sufficient votes for it to get passed in the National Council of Provinces, one of the other legislative bodies. And then you'll have other organizations that are going to challenge the failure to pay compensation stuff. But the Con Court doesn't just jump in. It's a court, so it has to wait until the fight arrives at its door. But on the disinformation front, what you had was allegations of disinformation against organizations like AfriForum and Solidarity, who went to America to say, this is what's going on in the country, and we're concerned about it. And we'd prefer it if you didn't have broad sanctions, like cutting off AGOA, which is one of the preferential trade treaties we have with Americans, but rather to have targeted sanctions against particular government officials. And so you had the press in chorus describing this as a misinformation, disinformation campaign, without ever explaining what the disinformation or misinformation was. So you say, hey, you're wrong for XYZ reasons. Okay, cool. Yeah, now we can have a discussion about it. Like, what do you think I'm misrepresenting? But you never had that. You just had this sort of bold lie of describing as misinformation. And that's basically just a censorship device. And of course, what you have is a ramping up of that to say, not only is this misinformation, this is misinformation that amounts to high treason, and these guys need to be investigated for it. High treason in South Africa traditionally had the death penalty. So you're basically saying that these guys are deserving of something analogous to the death penalty, like life imprisonment, for engaging in a lobbying process to say, hey, we're concerned about what's happening in our country. Something, by the way, that was done widely by the ANC during apartheid to say, hey, the apartheid government's doing all this terrible stuff, you should have sanctions. The idea of like lobbying other governments to have political change is something that was embraced by that movement, now being disavowed when it doesn't suit them.
So if our relationship with America is so important, then why is Ramaphosa going on stage saying he doesn't tell Donald Trump how to run his country? So why is Donald Trump getting involved with South African politics? He must stick his nose where it belongs, basically. That's unhinged, surely. And how is he allowed to do this stuff? Like, none of us voted for that. None of us said we agree with Cyril to be able to do this, in terms of like even the people who govern the law. Like, how are people just allowed to behave like so unhinged? It's just crazy to me.
It's unhinged for a couple of reasons. So one is you'll get what you ask for. If you say to America, keep your nose out of our business, they'll say, okay, well, no more foreign aid. The Americans fund a fair amount of projects in South Africa. We'll pass sanctions and we'll stop American businesses from dealing with you. And you can go and lead your own best life without us. That seems like a pretty disastrous situation to be in. The other one is it's incredibly hypocritical. So you have Cyril saying, we're a sovereign state and you shouldn't be interfering in our affairs, while engaging litigation against Israel at the International Court of Justice and saying, we are the moral saviors who are on the international stage holding this other government to account on the basis that they're genocide ideas. Like, hold on a second. You think like you can interfere in another sovereign country's stuff and that's totally fine and praiseworthy, but if America does it to you,
they must stick their nose in there.
Yeah. So it's like, hold on a second. Yeah. There's as you say, South Africans definitely didn't choose to sever our relationship with the Americans. You might also think that the 40% of voters who voted for the ANC might not have picked that path. But the party to hold accountable for this terrible behavior is, of course, the ANC. And so if you care about prosperity and you care about, the nice American products that you get, if you want to be able to keep using your iPhone and, drinking Coca-Cola and eating McDonald's, watching American movies, you think about how much of your life involves American stuff. Even the stuff that looks like it's, some other country's product probably has American resources involved in it or American shipping lanes, whatever it is. It's like you're asking to be brought back to like, a forgotten era. If you don't like that idea, then don't vote for the ANC.
But it's unhinged. I mean, isn't he a businessman? Surely he wants to make a negotiation. Surely he wants to come to a right deal instead of being right.
So I think the biggest lie that the South African public was sold is that Cyril is a businessman. So Cyril's very wealthy. The guy's a billionaire. Okay. But
how do you get to that stage?
Yes. So,
yes.
Well, so I'll tell you how. It's you either start a business, okay, you're an entrepreneur, you build something up from scratch, and then you are a businessman. So if you think about Elon Musk, Elon Musk is a businessman, right? Like he's built up Starlink, he's built up Tesla, he's like played a huge role in like all these incredible businesses, hired staff, innovated. How did Cyril become wealthy in businesses? Not from being a businessman, but from BE deals. So he got share options in a lot of these businesses. So you're dealing with someone who looks at a system like BE and goes, this is an amazing system because I'm the beneficiary of it. Like I've made a lot of money out of this. But he's not a businessman. He's not someone who cares about this business. Actually thinks one way to become rich is to bend businesses over a barrel. He's a labor guy. So like his prior qualifications before becoming exceedingly wealthy was being a trade unionist. So, which is traditionally an anti-business thing. So yeah, it's not surprising to me that, Cyril's conduct in this is so bad because he's not thinking like a businessman or a negotiator.
But surely his advisories.
I think that one of the worries is that there's a certain faction within the ANC who say, you know what? Let's rather sever our relationship with the evil West, who are a bunch of imperialist, colonialist pigs, and let's rather develop our relationships with those wonderful, prosperous nations like Venezuela and Cuba, who are doing so well.
Yeah, sure.
So who are we meeting with today? Ronald Lamola is meeting with the Cubans. ANC met with the Iranians. I think about 2% of our trade is with Iran. And Iran are regarded as a rogue terror state. So, and maybe that works out very well if you are those particular ANC officials. If you're in the elite in those terrible countries, you do pretty well. If you're Maduro, you have Salt Bay, like throwing salt on the freshly cut steak for you, and you're smoking great cigars and drinking whiskey while the peasants are on the Maduro diet because they've lost 30 kilos. But so be it. I mean, if you were in ZANU, you got access to some of the best healthcare, not in Zimbabwe, of course. You flew to Singapore for it, but you had nice mansions and nice cars, while everyone else lived lives of immense suffering.
Voila, yeah.
And so that's why I think if you want to change the incentive game, it must be very highly targeted. That those individuals who are basically selling South Africa's foreign policy to the worst bidders at the expense of average South Africans need to feel the pain. And so you want targeted approach against them. But yeah, I think some of them have very bad incentives. The idea that they're doing this for the good of the people, that they're the true vanguard, is belied by their actions.
Jeez. Okay. Okay, we've talked a lot about like politics and stuff. I knew we would kind of get into this because it's definitely your realm of things, but I obviously am very naive when it comes to this stuff. And also, you're very brave to talk about this stuff because there's a lot of backlash around it, and I'm not educated enough to argue with people. So that's why I just stay out of it completely. But I would kind of like the last segment of our podcast, if it's cool with you, to talk about you and like, had you since a child always been interested in philosophy and these big thought experiments and like, why am I here? And when did because you're a very conscious human being, like you absorb your entire environment and you're able to articulate it really well. When did you realize that level of consciousness, or at what age?
So one of my dad's favorite stories about me was when I was about 8. We had a big like family dinner, and one of the guys at the dinner was this judge I'd mentioned earlier. It was the first attorney to become a judge. And we were having a debate about a question in Jewish law. One of the things that you're not allowed to do on the Sabbath is carry certain objects. So it makes it very difficult if you push a pram, for example, from your house into the synagogue. It's prohibited. So what the community has done is they've built a thing called an Erev, which is basically like a wire around the community. And then that suspends the rules and treats the whole area as if it were the synagogue. And so you can do a lot of the stuff that makes your sort of life more practically easy. And I said to him, Basil, like God can see through the wire. This is a ridiculous thing. Like, how can I take this at all seriously? And so we had this like, big back and forth. And at some point, Basil sort of stood up and he said, you know what, Mark, just fuck off. And he stormed out.
To an 8-year-old.
Yeah. And my dad was like, if my little kid can get a judge to do that when he's that age, that's great. So, so I've kind of been argumentative and philosophical from a young age. I think I've always spoken my mind, and luckily enough, had family that were sort of supportive of that, and it's gotten me in trouble, on many occasions. And I think getting in trouble when you're young is probably quite a good thing, to be honest, because you learn like, hey, it's not the end of the world, like maybe your teachers didn't like that you said that, and you kind of have to like learn how to stand up for yourself, and that's okay. So my cousin did a PhD in philosophy at Cambridge, and so kind of having him around the dinner table made a big difference in terms of thinking about those big questions and having these discussions. Judaism as well is one of those faiths that's, I think, encouraging of children playing a role. So during Passover, for example, the children are incorporated into the ceremony. It's seen as a failure if your children check out. And so I engage with adults at a young age. The faith is sort of seen as something up for constant debate all the time. So the way that Orthodox people study is in pairs. So you have a chavruta partner who will, the one's job is to sort of prove the text and the other one's job is to disprove the text. And you're debating that clashing swords. So I think having that kind of background has made a difference. It's the reason why you find traditionally there were a lot of Jewish lawyers and there are a lot of Jewish philosophers. You know, it's baked into the faith and the way of being. And I think sort of being a little bit unusual, you know, being controversial, you know, happy to kind of play with controversial ideas can be a lonely path at times, you know, so that not everybody's up for that. A lot of people don't like it. I was lucky to have gone to the University of Cape Town at a golden era when we had some of like the brightest minds teaching us. I was taught by David Benatar, who's kind of regarded as one of the greatest philosophers internationally. And that environment of open inquiry, I think, made a big difference to who I am as a person and encouraging me to kind of start something like Brain Devat where we can have these interesting conversations.
Is that the guy who you were talking about God with? What interview did you do with him?
So Benatar, we've spoken about a number of topics with. We did a big discussion on the meaning of life.
Yes, that was it.
And we have a book that comes out of that. So there's a series of books that we made called Conversations in Philosophy that are available on Amazon. We did one on God with Graham Oppy and with a rabbi who's also an academic philosopher around the problem of evil. So the sort of problem is, given that there is evil in the world, that the terrible things happen either through people doing terrible things to each other or through natural disasters like volcanoes and tsunamis. If God is all good, all powerful, and all knowing, how are those things compatible?
Okay, so let's not go off topic here. You were saying that guy made a huge impact on your life and you went to UCT and then continue from there. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, so because I care about UCT, I'm on UCT's council at the moment. And the council is the kind of governing body of the university. And unfortunately, the university's been in a kind of downward spiral for quite a long time, I'd say for at least a decade. And it's sad to see a space that was the greatest university on the African continent that celebrated this variety of ideals, that cared a lot about excellence, that produced brilliant philosophers, lawyers, you know, scientists, abandon a lot of those values and succumb to violent protests, succumb to sort of like quite dangerous orthodoxies where academics feel very afraid of speaking out, where quite heavily politicized decisions have been made at the university. So UCT, despite its obligations to protect academic freedom, has passed a boycott of Israeli academics. And that's, of course, led to funders pulling out. A lot of Jews have traditionally funded UCT and are kind of justly outraged at the idea that the university would target Jewish students on campus, fail to protect them when they get surrounded by students shouting, "We are Hamas" at them. As I say, the place has become a sort of sad shadow of its former self.
Aren't they also in huge debt?
Gigantic debt. So students owe the university over 800 million rand because you basically had a de facto policy of free education. So the prior vice chancellor, I think, just kind of told everybody, don't worry, if you don't pay your fees, you can still graduate. We're not going to hold you liable. Everything will be fine. And so this debt just completely spirals. It's not at all a sustainable situation that if you expect that university to continue to operate, people have to pay for their education. You know, the university kind of finds itself in a situation where it's held hostage, where thousands of students will storm the campus and say, "You're not letting us register." And they say, "Well, it's because you didn't pay." And they go, "Well, why should that be a problem?" And so then concessions are granted. And I think a recent round of 30 million rands worth of concessions were granted, money the university doesn't have, which means eventually what you'll have is you're unable to pay your staff properly. The executive guys earn pretty well. I sort of, being a council member, get access to what the administrators earn. And they earn, some of the guys earn more than the president earns. I mean, the money's very good. They earn more than people in like massive industries earn. But they're presiding over an institution that's, you know, really been brought down to its knees. It is still an amazing place and with such wonderful opportunities. And it would be nice for it to be reborn. It also used to have very good relationships with overseas institutions. So when I was studying, we had a lot of American students on exchange from Ivy League universities who would say, wow, like University of Cape Town is this incredible place. Like the caliber of students and of staff is like world class. My law school was 40th in the world when I was there. I think it's tumbled down the rankings since.
Oh, crazy. And one thing I said to you on the phone when we discussed this was, I cannot for the life of me understand how people think things are for free. Like, how do you not realize that a teacher has to put fuel in their car to drive to work, and they have to earn a salary, and there has to be lights and electricity and Wi-Fi and maintenance, and someone is paying for all this stuff? Who do they think is paying for this? This is what I don't understand when students want free education. Who is supposed to be paying for this stuff?
Well, that's the point, is that nothing is free. Someone has to pay. And what we've done is shrink our tax base. I think about 85% of South African tax revenue comes from 1 in 30 South Africans. So that's like tiny, like 3% of people are carrying this huge burden on their shoulders. At some point, those people are going to say, I can't carry the load anymore. I can't pay this. It's my business is crumbling. Opportunities are calling me abroad. There's a sort of strange view the South African government has over South African citizens, is that they're all like stuck in a cage. They're not. The most brilliant, innovative people will leave. Imagine if Elon Musk
been happening.
Stayed in South Africa and built those incredible businesses in South Africa. Firstly, it's unimaginable because their environment is so restrictive. I mean, he's trying to provide Starlink in South Africa, and he says, the African government won't let me do it because I'm not willing to comply with your race-based laws. But if you were that innovation hub, if Tesla was a South African firm, if we were launching rockets off to go and rescue people at the International Space Station, incredible, because we have the talent. We have incredible people in South Africa, but they're being driven from our shores.
Yeah, sad state of affairs. Okay, but I want to get back quickly just to your journey. So in high school, were you part of a debate team?
I wasn't. And there were times when I felt like I should have been. And later years, I actually did training for high school debates. And I think debating has two different formats. So the one is a philosophical format where you're trying to produce the best possible arguments in favor of a position. And I think that's really good training. And you try and unpick fallacious reasoning, and you equip students to think in that manner. And that's the one school. What is
fallacious reasoning?
Fallacious reasoning is when you jump to a conclusion without the correct resources in an argument. And there's a number of ways in which you could have a fallacy. And so there's a sort of formal fallacies that are in place. A good example is something like correlation and causation are different. So people will say, I did this thing and this other thing happened afterwards. So therefore, what I did must have caused it. But actually, it might just be a mere coincidence that happened. And so those sorts of reasoning processes are important to inculcate in people. The other style of debating is highly rhetoric-driven, which is that it's emotional, that it's about lambasting the other side, that it's about taking strange technical points, it's about showmanship. And I think a lot of that stuff can actually make you a worse person and a worse citizen. And a lot of the kind of dangerous public figures came through that school of debating. So I think of someone like Eusebius McKaiser, who was very involved in debating, as being quite a dangerous figure in the South African landscape, who would spread racial hatred, animosities, and would use rhetoric as opposed to reason. Interesting enough, Eusebius had a philosophy background as well, so knew what he was doing, could have used tools of reason and didn't. So in some senses, I'm glad I avoided the debating path. Funny enough, there is another Mark Oppenheimer, and there are many similarities between us. He was a professional debater when he was younger and wrote a book about his time called Weisenheimer, which I think is like a great title for a book, and had followed that sort of path of reasoned debate and continues to do so. He's a journalist and an academic and a podcaster.
Okay, so you weren't a debater. From school, you went to UCT to study law. How did you know that that's what you wanted to do?
I think I'd known since I was little that law was the right thing for me. And maybe some of that is being an argumentative kid, being quite verbal, enjoying argument, and other people saying, oh, you should become a lawyer. I think part of that is people don't really know what it is to be a lawyer. That what a lot of lawyers do is kind of dull and technical. And I'm lucky that I get to do the law that's really fun and looks more like what you'd expect to see on TV. So yeah, it was never really a question that I would do anything else. Adding in the philosophy, I think, was like one of the most wonderful things to do because it makes you a much better lawyer and a much better person. I think you start to care about the deep problems in life. and you care about value. So I think some of the mistakes that people make in life is that they value the wrong things. Someone might think that being successful is about being incredibly wealthy. And I think having access to money is important. It opens up a lot of other choices. But I don't think that having a Lamborghini is going to make you that much happier. One of the discussions I remember having with friends beginning of COVID was, if we all became billionaires overnight, what would we do with the money? And the thought I had was, well, it would be quite amazing to be able to bring out some of the greatest minds and have dinner parties with them, fly them out, and have these discussions about things that are important. And then I realized I can do that for free with Brain Vat. And I've continued to do that for 5 years. It's one of the most meaningful things that I do.
Wow.
I think when you look back on your life and you're on your deathbed and you think, what are the moments that were important? We think our friendships are important. We think our family is important. We think about important emotional moments. But we think about, did I grapple with the big ideas? Did I plunge the depths? I don't think I spend all this time polishing my Ferrari is going to be like that important or that meaningful.
What star sign are you?
I am a Scorpio Sagittarius cusp.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was going to ask if you're Scorpio, because you definitely like to delve into the darkness. You're not afraid of it.
On that note, so I'm quite a big fan of personality testing. So I think some of the ways people get into personality stuff is through things like star signs because they look similar. And so my kind of favorite typing system is the Myers-Briggs system. And I'm an ENTP, which is called the debater. So it's extroverted, intuitive thinking, and prospecting. So my types like to think quite abstractly. We like a lot of personal freedom, and we like doing it with other people. So that extroversion means that's conversation and dialogue and trying to find out what's true is very important to us. And I think one way to lead a healthy life and be less disappointed by people is understanding the bit of software that's in them. I think a lot of people will either meet me and go like, man, what a wonderful conversation. I had such a joyride having those, thinking about all those ideas, and I hadn't thought about that, and that was great. And other people will run for the hills because they're like, oh my God, this is the guy said like a whole bunch of controversial stuff, and it's very offensive. And so a certain kind of person who's, let's say, like a sensing feeling type is going to find this kind of difficult. So yeah, I think understanding different languages and ways of being in the world is quite useful.
How old are you now?
41.
Okay. And what's the dream for the future? So you have your podcast, you are very actively involved in many different projects that are close to your heart. Are there any other passion projects or things that you would like to get involved with later down the line, or things you haven't tried in your life?
So I'm a big believer in cross-training, and like doing a variety of things is cool. And we've sort of spoken about philosophy and law and how they intersect. There are certain things that I'm very, very bad at. So like I have like these terrible fine motor coordination problems. For me to like handwrite something is like very difficult. But I have an affinity for art and for beautiful things. And so when I was in my 20s, I was a photographer. And so that allows you to conceive of something quite beautiful and then photograph that, by capturing it and then, working on it digitally. And one of the things that I've been doing quite a lot recently is playing around with AI art. So I think AI is a very interesting tool. I think it's a collaborative process. It requires a vision and a concept to make an object, and it requires lots of iteration. One of the things I did recently was make a graphic novel, which was really fun. So I took a short story by Kurt Vonnegut, one of the great writers, and adapted this thing into like a 40-page graphic novel and printed it out so people can like hold it in their hand. And that's quite a cool thing to do. And I think going through that process makes you a more fulfilled person. It makes you appreciate how hard it is to make beautiful objects in the world. And also I think getting stuff out, a lot of artists are kind of haunted by this idea of, but if I make it and it's not very good, I'm going to be a failure. So instead I'll dream it and I'll never deliver it because then I never fail. And one of the things that I learned from my friend Jason, he had a writing partner and they would meet very regularly and they would write together. And Jason would publish the novel first. And his friend said to him, but there's a whole bunch of problems with the novel. Like, you're going to get criticism for it. He said, don't worry, I'll fix the criticism in the next novel. And Jason produced 15 novels. The other guy produced 0. And I think that ability to say, I'd rather put out a thing in the world that's not perfect, and I will learn from that process that completing it will give me an opportunity to fix it. Very interesting. Funny enough, that first novel has a really cool idea in it, like a really interesting, like philosophical idea about who are you over time? Are you your mind? Are you your body? What if we could keep your consciousness alive, but put you in a different body? What if that body looked like your old body? And so the idea that he had at the time was we could 3D print it. So we shred your old body and we 3D print your new body, and we could print it with a whole bunch of mental states as well, like in experiences. I just watched the movie a couple of days ago called Mickey 17, which is going to be this gigantic, huge blockbuster, and it involves 3D printed bodies with this idea. So Jason had this really fantastic idea that's now like in a big Hollywood movie, and that's very cool.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Okay, so you're just playing around with things with AI, like music. You made the album and you made a vinyl out of it, which is so cool.
Yeah, this was really fun. Like, there's something about having that creative surge, which is a little bit like having poison in you that's got to be drained.
Yes.
And so, after a long day's work, instead of sitting down and watching a movie, I was like, I need to go and like make the next song for this album. And it was super fun. And it's different from being a musician. So the software that I use is called Suno, and I use ChatGPT for doing the writing. But I would think about the idea. I was like, wouldn't it be cool to have like a concept album based on John Carpenter movies? So John Carpenter did all these like kind of 80s sci-fi films and also did all the music for them. And he had this genre of music that's become kind of popular later called retrowave, that has this sort of like synth sound to it and a kind of like spookiness to it. The way that you do it is a bit more like being a casting director. So you're like Simon Cowell and you're like, you write a song and you're like, okay, cool, someone sing it for me. And then you're auditioning a whole bunch of people to sing it. And you're like, okay, hold on. You sound like you know what you're doing. That's pretty cool. All right, I'm going to make you my band. And then that band can sort of make more and more songs for you. So it led to like a big appreciation for like how hard it is to make music. What are the sort of structural elements in it? You don't get to make it directly, so you're kind of indirectly making it, but it generates like a big appreciation. And then it's quite cool to like have an LP out in the world that you can like show people and put on a record player. And then I made all the artwork for it. So yeah, it's a fun thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Is there anything you wanted to touch on that we didn't touch on?
No, this has been an absolutely fabulous conversation. You'll notice that my general tendency is to rather speak about ideas and projects as opposed to myself.
Yes.
But I hope that the things that I do give a reflection for the kind of person that I am.
Actually, one thing I did want to ask, and it's not necessarily for the podcast, but how do you absorb so much information from reading? Like, I don't have the capacity to do that. Like, I'll read something and I absorb it, fine, but 10 pages max. Is it something that you have to build up over time, or?
Yeah, I think these are muscles. So my sister got married recently, and she asked me for a bit of advice about what the law looks like. And so I said, oh, have a look at this case. And I think nothing about reading a 50-page case. It's like one of those things you would just do.
That is insane.
And she looked at it and was like, this is the most my brain has burnt ever. I don't know how you do this. I mean, I'm probably reading for 5 hours a day every day. And then when I'm not reading, I'm like having conversations with people. So I think you do develop a skill of learning how to read very rapidly, learning how to memorize certain things. I've got quite a good affinity for holding facts in my mind. And I think that's through deliberate practice. There's also, I think, different methods that people use to memorize things. Mine's probably quite unconventional in some senses. Like some people have these structured memory palaces and they kind of visualize being in a room and they can hold objects in their mind because of that. I think a little bit like an argument structure, like a tree. So you have, the root of the tree and then all the different branches. And then each branch has certain bits of facts in it, but you can kind of see, the opening premises of it and then the conclusion. And if I'm following that logical structure, then because I'm going along that train and I know what the branches are supposed to look like, the facts then come to me very easily. I also realize that I have an affinity for conversation and for memorizing conversation, partly because I mentioned that my handwriting's so terrible. So I never took any notes. I would then have to very attentively listen and very attentively read so that I could have the information. And I think because a lot of people wouldn't do that, they didn't develop the skill. And I think sometimes having a certain kind of disability can be very useful because you end up developing a technique that others wouldn't develop. I think one way to speak well is to listen well. One of the things that I do on the show is I almost never interrupt my guest. I sit and I listen and I'm in the conversation with them. I often read quite a lot in advance, but not always. Sometimes, we interview someone once a week and they're experts in their field. People say to me, it's not possible to do something like that because of all the research you'd have to do. And some of it is you build up this network of knowledge, and some of it is if you're fully present with someone else, you can then see where the conversation needs to go in that moment, as opposed to writing down 10 questions and then just methodically going through them in a way that's not authentic to where that conversation must go. I think being a good interviewer is about creating space. So I don't think you need to have the technical knowledge. And in some senses, the advantage you've had in this conversation is approaching someone who's not a lawyer. So you could ask the questions that a lawyer might feel embarrassed to ask, but you have no reason to feel embarrassed because, like, I'm not a lawyer, I don't know that stuff. And then I can give you the detail, which is really cool. So we can talk about foundational things like, how's our democracy set up? Like, where do our laws generate from? Because you can ask the right questions from the right place. That's partly why with Brain and Vat, like, Jason has certain expertise that I don't have. And so I can ask it like a child would ask it because it's a basic question. And the philosopher is trained to sort of give you a good answer in a way that's really polite instead of belittling you saying that's a stupid question to ask. And then we can also go into the weeds once we know, like, oh yeah, this is a really cool technical question that we know a lot about. Let's, like, keep bushwhacking until we get an answer.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that was a really good answer as well. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this podcast. I feel like I've touched on everything that I wanted to, and it was really nice to have a conversation with you. So thanks for showing up for me. Thank you so much for watching this episode. I really appreciate it. If you want to see anybody else on the podcast, please drop a comment below. If you have any questions for Mark or want to find his information, I will put it in the description below. And thanks for joining once again.